The expedition delayed its departure by 3 hours on the morning of September 14, 1902, because the lead surveyor wanted to finish his breakfast in peace. This detail appears in a marginal note in the field journal of Thomas Bridwell, assistant to the Northern Alberta Geological Survey team, written in careful pencil. Waited for Cartwright. He ate slowly. We all did. The note includes no sense of urgency, no suggestion that those 3 hours mattered. In the context of what followed, they constituted roughly half the margin between survival and what the official inquiry would later term misadventure through accumulated delay. The team consisted of 6 men: Martin Cartwright, the chief surveyor, age 41, his assistant Thomas Bridwell, 28, 2 hired packers from Edmonton, Joseph Renault and his cousin Albert, both in their 30s, a cook named William Moss, 54, and a geologist on temporary assignment from the Dominion government, Dr. Edmund Fairchild, 36. They had been contracted to map mineral deposits along the upper tributaries of the Athabasca River, a region sparsely documented and considered, in the language of the survey office, accessible but remote. They had entered the backcountry on August 29th, with supplies for 6 weeks. The work had proceeded without incident. Cartwright's reports, filed at a Hudson's Bay Company post and later retrieved by investigators, noted good weather, adequate game, and terrain as anticipated. The team had fallen slightly behind schedule due to difficult crossings and denser forest than expected, but nothing in the reports suggested concern. On September 12th, Cartwright wrote, "We are 2 days slower than planned, but the weather holds and morale is excellent. We'll complete the western quadrant by the 20th. On the morning of September 14th, the camp was situated on a gravel bar beside a tributary the men called Fisher Creek, though it appears on no contemporary map. Bridwell's journal describes the site as open and pleasant, with good water and firewood abundant. The weather had been clear for 5 consecutive days. Autumn was approaching, but temperatures remained mild during daylight hours. There was no snow on the ground. The plan for that day was straightforward. Break camp, proceed northeast along the creek for approximately 8 miles, establish a new camp, and begin surveying a ridge system that Cartwright believed might contain copper deposits. The route had been scouted 2 days prior by Renault, who reported it passable with minimal clearing required. At 6 in the morning, Moss began preparing breakfast. Cartwright remained in his tent, writing correspondence. Bridwell noted this without judgment. "The chief often writes in the morning. He says it helps him think. By 7, the camp should have been packed." Instead, Bridwell records that Cartwright emerged at 7:30 and requested coffee. "He seemed in no hurry," Bridwell wrote. "We took our time. The delay might have meant nothing under different circumstances. But at 9:15, as the team finally began loading the pack horses, a wind arrived from the northwest. Bridwell described it as sudden, but not violent. The temperature dropped noticeably. Fairchild, the geologist, remarked that the sky had changed color. He said it looked like weather, Bridwell wrote, but nobody seemed worried. Cartwright consulted his barometer. The reading had fallen, but not dramatically. He made a note in his log, "Pressure dropping, will monitor." Then he gave the order to proceed. They left the gravel bar at 9:40. What is documented beyond dispute is that Cartwright called a brief halt at 10:30, approximately 2 miles from the previous camp. Renault later testified, he and his cousin were the only survivors, that Cartwright gathered the men and presented what he called a prudent option. The wind had strengthened. Clouds were building to the northwest. They could return to the gravel bar, which offered shelter and known resources, and wait out whatever weather might come. Or they could press on to the next planned camp, roughly 6 miles ahead, where Renault had noted a stand of dense spruce that would provide adequate wind protection. Renault recalled that Cartwright phrased it as a question, not a directive. "He asked what we thought," Renault said in his deposition. "He said both choices seemed reasonable." Bridwell's journal contains a single line about this moment. "Discussed whether to go back. Decided to continue. Weather did not look serious." The vote, as Renault remembered it, was not formal, but consensus emerged quickly. Moss said he did not want to unpack the supplies they had just loaded. Fairchild noted that the forecast from Edmonton, received a week earlier, had predicted stable conditions through mid-September. Bridwell said that the new camp would put them back on schedule. Renault and his cousin expressed no strong opinion either way. Cartwright made the final determination. "We'll proceed," he said. "If it worsens, we'll make shelter where we stand." They resumed walking at 10:50. The last entry in Bridwell's journal, written that evening, reads, "Reached the new site at 4 o'clock. Tired but in good spirits. Fairchild shot a grouse. Wind still up, but we are well sheltered. Cartwright says we made the right choice." The final line of the entry, added in different ink and shakier handwriting, was presumably written later, perhaps the following day. It began to snow after dark, heavily. Weather in the northern Alberta interior during early autumn was understood, even in 1902, to be variable. But the variability was not considered dangerous in the way that winter blizzards were dangerous, or spring floods, or summer wildfires. The men on the survey team had all spent time in the backcountry. Cartwright had led similar expeditions for nearly 15 years. Renault and his cousin had worked as wilderness guides since adolescence. None of them were naive. The danger they failed to perceive was not the weather itself, but the timing. In testimony given 4 months later, Joseph Renault attempted to explain how the team had assessed the situation. "September snow is not unusual," he said. "It comes, it melts. We've all seen it. What we did not expect, what nobody could expect, was that it would not stop." The snow began shortly after nightfall on September 14th. Bridwell's journal does not record the exact time, but Renault estimated it was around 8 o'clock. At first it was light, the kind of snow that might accumulate an inch or two and then taper off by morning. Renault recalled that the men joked about it. Moss said something about an early taste of winter. Fairchild wondered aloud whether they should have returned to the gravel bar after all, but he said it without apparent concern, as if testing the question rather than seriously regretting the choice. By morning there were 6 inches on the ground. Cartwright's practice, according to Bridwell, was to assess conditions at first light and make decisions accordingly. On the morning of September 15th, Cartwright examined the snow, checked his barometer, which had continued to fall, and consulted briefly with Renault. Then he announced that they would remain in camp for the day. He said it would be foolish to travel in poor visibility, Renault recalled. He was calm, we all were. The decision was logical. The camp was well supplied. Firewood was abundant, the tents were secure, and the spruce grove provided excellent wind protection. Remaining stationary in marginal conditions was standard wilderness practice. Cartwright had done it many times before. What the team did not discuss, or at least did not record discussing, was the possibility of returning to the gravel bar while the route was still passable. At that point, the morning of September 15th, they had been away from the bar for less than 24 hours. The trail was familiar. With effort, they could have retraced their steps in a single day, even in snow. But effort seemed unnecessary. The assumption, articulated by no one but apparently shared by all, was that the weather would break soon, that they would lose a day, perhaps 2, and then resume work. Delay was inconvenient, not catastrophic. Cartwright had food for 5 more weeks. Winter was not due for another month at least. Bridwell's journal entry for September 15th is brief. Snowing steadily, remained in camp, spirits good. Moss made a stew. On September 16th, the snow continued. Accumulation had reached 14 inches. Cartwright called another assessment. According to Renault, the discussion was slightly more serious this time. Fairchild suggested they consider heading back toward the gravel bar, not because he believed they were in danger, but because it seemed prudent to move toward known resources rather than remain static in deepening snow. Cartwright agreed that it was worth considering, but Moss pointed out that traveling in heavy snow with loaded pack horses would be slow and exhausting, and that if they were simply going to wait out the weather, they might as well do so where they were, rather than expend energy moving to a location that offered no significant advantage. Renault remembered that Bridwell sided with Moss. He said we should give it 1 more day, Renault testified. If the snow stopped, we could dry out and move forward. If it kept up, we would reassess. Cartwright agreed. He trusted the barometer, Renault said. It had stopped falling. He thought the worst was over. That afternoon, Renault and his cousin cut additional firewood and reinforced the tents with spruce boughs. The work was routine, precautionary. Nobody spoke of danger. Renault recalled that the men played cards that evening. Fairchild read aloud from a book he had brought, a popular adventure novel whose title Renault could not remember. The mood, he said, was not tense. We were uncomfortable, he testified, but not afraid. On the morning of September 17th, the snow had deepened to 22 inches. It was still falling. Cartwright made no journal entry that day, or if he did, it was never recovered. Bridwell's journal ends on September 15th. The only account of what happened after that comes from Joseph Renaud and his cousin Albert, both of whom survived by leaving the camp on the morning of September 18th against Cartwright's orders. Renaud described September 17th as the day when unease began to spread, though still without panic. Cartwright called a meeting. He acknowledged that the snow was heavier than anticipated and that their position was becoming less comfortable. He proposed two options: remain in place and conserve energy and supplies, or attempt to return to the gravel bar. He noted that the return journey, now through nearly 2 feet of snow, would be difficult and might take 2 days instead of 1. He also noted that the horses were weakening, that forage was buried, and that pushing the animals hard might cost them their transport. Fairchild argued for immediate departure. He said we were gambling, Renaud recalled, and that the odds were getting worse. Moss argued for staying. He pointed out that they had plenty of food, that the tents were warm, and that attempting a forced march through deep snow in continuing bad weather could expose them to frostbite or injury. Better to be cold and dry here, he said, than cold and wet on the trail. Bridwell, according to Renaud, said nothing. He appeared tired. Cartwright made the decision. They would stay 1 more day. If the snow had not stopped by the morning of September 18th, they would leave regardless of conditions. Renaud and his cousin spoke privately that evening. We decided we would not wait, Renaud testified, not because we thought Cartwright was wrong, just because we thought waiting was worse than moving. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Renaud estimated it reached 15 degrees Fahrenheit, far colder than any night earlier in the expedition. The cold, combined with the snow depth, made it clear that they were no longer experiencing an early autumn storm. They were effectively in winter. The last opportunity to leave as a group, with all supplies and a reasonable expectation of success, occurred on the morning of September 17th, before Cartwright's meeting. By then the snow was deep, but not yet unmanageable. The horses were weak but still functional, and the men were uncomfortable but not debilitated. A determined march, even through difficult conditions, would likely have brought them back to the gravel bar by nightfall on September 18th, and from there they could have retreated downriver toward the Hudson's Bay post, a journey of perhaps 5 days under normal conditions, possibly 8 or 9 in snow. Renaud believed in retrospect that if Cartwright had simply announced a retreat without calling a meeting, the men would have followed without question. We trusted him, Renaud said. If he had said we are leaving, we would have left. But he asked us what we thought, and when you ask, people give different answers. The meeting lasted approximately an hour. The tone, Renaud recalled, was civil and thoughtful. No one raised their voice. Cartwright listened to each man's opinion, asked clarifying questions, and made his decision only after everyone had spoken. It was, by any standard, a reasonable process. But the process consumed time. And time, though no one articulated this during the meeting, was the one resource they could not recover. By the time Cartwright announced they would wait another day, the afternoon of September 17th was already underway. The temperature continued to drop. The snow continued to fall. The window that had been open that morning, narrow but open, was closing. Renaud and his cousin made their decision after dark. They did not seek Cartwright's permission, nor did they attempt to persuade the others to join them. We did not think they would come, Renaud explained, and we did not want to argue. We just wanted to go. They left at approximately 4 in the morning on September 18th, taking minimal supplies: one rifle, a small amount of dried meat, matches, and a blanket each. They left the horses, the tents, and the bulk of the expedition's equipment. They told no one they were leaving. Renault testified that as they walked away from the camp, he looked back once and saw the tents, still standing, dimly visible in the pre-dawn darkness. "I thought about waking them," he said. "I thought they might follow, but I didn't. I don't know why." The journey took 6 days. Renault and his cousin reached the gravel bar on the evening of September 18th, having traveled through the night and most of the following day. They rested briefly, then continued downriver. The snow stopped on September 19th, but temperatures remained below freezing. They encountered no other travelers. On September 23rd, they reached a trapper's cabin, abandoned for the season but stocked with emergency supplies. They remained there for 2 days, recovering their strength. On September 25th, they resumed walking. On September 28th, they encountered a Hudson's Bay Company supply party traveling upriver and were taken to the post. Renault's first act upon reaching the post was to report the location of the survey team and request a rescue party. The post factor, Alexander McLeod, organized a relief effort immediately, but weather and snow depth delayed departure until October 2nd. The rescue party, which included Renault as a guide, reached the gravel bar on October 8th and the Spruce Grove camp on October 10th. They found the camp largely intact. The tents were still standing, though partially collapsed under snow. The horses were dead, apparently shot. Inside the largest tent, they found the bodies of Martin Cartwright, Thomas Bridwell, Edmund Fairchild, and William Moss. The official report, filed by McLeod and forwarded to the Dominion Survey Office, noted that all 4 men appeared to have died of exposure and malnutrition. There were no signs of injury, violence, or struggle. The camp showed evidence of sustained occupation, careful rationing of firewood, orderly arrangement of supplies, and systematic efforts to maintain the tents. A journal fragment, believed to have been written by Cartwright, was found near his body. It was dated September 22nd and consisted of a single sentence: "We waited too long." The rescue party buried the bodies on site, marked the location, and returned to the post with the expedition's records and personal effects. A formal inquiry was convened in Edmonton in February 1903. Renault and his cousin were questioned extensively, but were not charged with any wrongdoing. The inquiry concluded that the deaths were accidental, that Cartwright had exercised reasonable judgment under difficult circumstances, and that no individual was at fault. The inquiry did note, however, that the decision to delay departure on September 17th represented the critical juncture. The report stated, had the party commenced a return march on the morning of September 17th, it is the opinion of this board that they would likely have reached safety. The delay of 1 additional day reduced their chances substantially. By the morning of September 18th, when departure finally became necessary, conditions had deteriorated to the point where success was improbable. Renault was asked during the inquiry why he and his cousin had chosen to leave when they did. He answered, "We felt that every hour mattered. Not because we knew something bad would happen, just because we felt it." Asked whether he believed Cartwright had made a mistake, Renault paused for a long time before answering. "No," he finally said. "He made a choice. We all made choices. His was to wait, ours was to go." The recovery of the survey team's records provided a detailed reconstruction of the expedition's timeline, decision-making process, and ultimate failure. What emerged from the documents was not a story of recklessness or incompetence, but of systematic misjudgment rooted in reasonable assumptions. Cartwright's reports, written during the weeks leading up to the snowstorm, reveal a man confident in his planning and aware of the risks inherent in wilderness work. He had calculated food supplies carefully, built in margins for delays, and maintained regular communication with the Hudson's Bay Post. His meteorological records, though limited by the instruments available at the time, showed consistent attention to weather patterns. He was, by all evidence, a competent and cautious leader. The inquiry reviewed Cartwright's barometric readings in detail. On the morning of September 14th, when the team departed the gravel bar, the barometer read 29.8 inches of mercury and falling. By the evening of September 14th, it had dropped to 29.4 inches. By September 15th, it had stabilized at 29.3 inches and remained there through September 17th. Cartwright interpreted the stabilization as an indication that the storm was moderating, a conclusion that would have been reasonable under most circumstances. What he could not have known was that the system had stalled, and that the snowfall, though steady rather than violent, would continue for days rather than hours. The inquiry's meteorological consultant, Dr. Harold Evans of the University of Alberta, testified that early autumn snowstorms in the region typically lasted between 12 and 36 hours. A storm lasting more than 3 days was, in his assessment, highly unusual, though not unprecedented. Evans noted that predicting storm duration with the instruments available in 1902 was largely guesswork, and that Cartwright's interpretation of the barometric data was consistent with accepted practice. Where Cartwright erred, the inquiry concluded, was not in his reading of the weather, but in his assessment of risk tolerance. The report stated, the deceased appeared to operate under the assumption that remaining in camp carried minimal risk, provided supplies were adequate. This assumption failed to account for the psychological and physical effects of prolonged cold exposure, the difficulty of retreat through accumulating snow, and the narrowing margin for error as conditions deteriorated. In practical terms, the inquiry found that Cartwright had underestimated how quickly the situation could shift from uncomfortable to critical. Each day of delay reduced the team's physical capacity, weakened the horses, deepened the snow, and increased the energy required to retreat. By the time Cartwright concluded that retreat was necessary, presumably sometime between September 18th and September 20th, the team was no longer capable of executing the plan. Dr. Fairchild's personal correspondence, recovered from his effects, included a letter written on September 16th, but never sent. In it, he expressed frustration with the decision to remain in camp. Cartwright believes we can outwait this weather, Fairchild wrote. I believe we are betting our lives on his optimism. The letter continued, I have argued for retreat, but I am the only one. The others seem content to sit and wait. Perhaps they are right. I am not a wilderness man. I defer to their experience, but I cannot shake the feeling that we are making a mistake. Fairchild's letter was found in his tent, tucked into his journal. There is no evidence that he shared these concerns with Cartwright or the others after September 16th. Renault, when asked during the inquiry whether he had sensed doubt among the men, answered that Fairchild had seemed worried, but that no one had spoken openly about fear or disagreement. The inquiry examined the question of whether Renault and his cousin bore any responsibility for not warning the others before their departure. Renault testified that he and Albert had briefly considered waking the camp, but had decided against it. We thought they would try to stop us, he said, or that we would have to argue. We did not want to argue. We just wanted to go. Asked whether he believed the others would have followed if given the opportunity, Renault said, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. The inquiry ruled that Renault and his cousin had acted within their rights as independent contractors and had no legal obligation to remain with the party or to coordinate their departure. The board noted, however, that it is unfortunate that the opportunity for group discussion was not provided, as the departure of 2 experienced guides might have influenced the remaining members to reconsider their position. William Moss left behind a widow and 3 children in Edmonton. Thomas Bridwell was unmarried. Dr. Fairchild was survived by his parents and a younger sister. Martin Cartwright's wife, Helen, testified at the inquiry. She stated that her husband had been meticulous in his planning and had never taken unnecessary risks. When asked if she believed his death could have been prevented, she answered, he believed he had time. I do not blame him for that. The Hudson's Bay Company paid death benefits to the families. The Dominion government provided a small settlement as well. The Survey Office revised its protocols for wilderness expeditions, mandating earlier retreat deadlines and stricter weather thresholds for continued operation. The changes were implemented in 1904. The gravel bar where the team had camped on September 13th was never formally named, though it appears on some later maps as Cartwright Bar. The spruce grove where the 4 men died remains unmarked. The graves were not relocated. The site is now within the boundaries of a provincial wilderness area and is accessible only by foot or horseback. It is not visited often. In reviewing the records of the 1902 survey expedition, what emerges most clearly is not the presence of error, but the absence of decisive action. The tragedy was not the result of a single catastrophic mistake, but of a series of small, reasonable decisions that, in aggregate, produced an irreversible outcome. At each decision point, September 14th, when the team could have returned to the gravel bar after noticing the wind shift, September 15th, when they could have retreated before the snow deepened, September 16th, when retreat was still possible though difficult, and September 17th, when retreat remained feasible with effort. The choice to wait seemed in isolation defensible. The weather might improve. The barometer had stabilized. The camp was secure. Supplies were adequate. Retreat was exhausting and uncertain. Staying was, if not comfortable, at least predictable. But time, the one element that could not be stockpiled or recovered, was spent with each passing hour. And by the time the team recognized that they had waited too long, they no longer had the strength or the margin to act. This pattern, the slow accumulation of delay, the erosion of options, the quiet passage of opportunity, is not unique to the Cartwright expedition. It appears in many historical disappearances and backcountry tragedies. What distinguishes this case is the quality of the documentation. We know with unusual specificity what the men were thinking, how they assessed their situation, and why they made the choices they did. And what the records show is that they were not irrational, not reckless, not ignorant. They were experienced men, making considered decisions, who simply believed they had more time than they did. Joseph Renault lived until 1954. In later years, he occasionally spoke about the expedition, though he did not seek attention for his survival. In a 1938 interview with a regional newspaper, he was asked what he had learned from the experience. He answered that it's easier to move when you're not sure you have to than to move when you're sure you have to. Renault was also asked whether he believed Cartwright should have ordered a retreat on September 14th, immediately upon noticing the weather change. He considered the question for a long time. Maybe, he said, but nobody retreats from weather that hasn't happened yet. You wait. Everyone waits. That's how you get caught. The inquiry's final report included a recommendation that wilderness parties establish fixed retreat deadlines independent of observed conditions, a principle that has since become standard in modern expedition planning. The logic is simple. If retreat is triggered by the arrival of danger, it is often too late. Retreat must be triggered by the approach of danger or by the passage of time, even when danger has not yet materialized. But this principle, though easy to state, is difficult to apply. It requires acting on fear that may not be justified, abandoning plans that may still succeed, and accepting failure that may be premature. It requires moving when movement feels unnecessary, and for that reason it is often ignored or applied too late, or not applied at all. The Cartwright expedition ended because 6 men, faced with uncertainty and discomfort, chose to wait for clarity that never came. They did not die in a storm. They died after the storm, in the cold, slow days that followed, when retreat was no longer possible and waiting was no longer a choice. The last known words written by Martin Cartwright, found on a scrap of paper near his body, were not a cry for help or an expression of despair. They were a simple statement of fact. We waited too long. There is no record of panic, no evidence of conflict, no indication that the men turned on each other or abandoned their discipline. They maintained their camp, rationed their supplies, and cared for each other until they could no longer do so. They died, as the inquiry noted, in an orderly fashion. What killed them was not the weather, or the cold, or the snow. What killed them was the belief, sustained through days of worsening conditions, that it was still too early to be afraid.